Hello. The Divine Code reading for December 23rd, pages 397 and 398. We are in Chapter 2, the Prohibition against Murder and Injury, Chapter 2, Suicide and Sanctifying One's Life for the Seven Noahide Commandments. And we're in topic number 2, footnote 74. So the mention was, the footnote is concerning one who is about to be caught by enemies and is certain that they will torture and kill him. He has no natural means of being saved. He is permitted to take his own life before he is attacked. As it says, "But your blood of your souls I will demand." The wording "but" implies that it's the exclusion of a case where suicide is possible. Now this is a verse out of Genesis chapter 9, verse 5. Footnote 74, see Prohibition Rabbah 34, Oris Chaim, cited by Bedek, Abayat, Yoredea 157, and Bach and Shach, Yoredea 157. The permission of these sources applies to a Jewish victim that might be faced with torture that he could not withstand. It might cause him to succumb to desecration of God's name, to be discussed at the in footnote 79. A Jew is obligated to sanctify God's name. For the sake of 3 specific Jewish commandments, and one who fails to do so desecrates God's name. On the other hand, a Gentile has no such obligation, as mentioned in this work several times in volume 1, part 1, topic 4.7. Therefore, avoiding desecration of God's name might not be a valid reason to permit suicide for Gentiles. So the Jew has an obligation, a positive obligation, to sanctify God's name. And if he fails to do that, he is desecrating God's name. Therefore, because the Jew has a positive obligation, it could be argued that he would be required to give up his life rather than be put in a situation where he is going to desecrate God's name. Because he has the positive obligation, therefore, suicide in that situation would be considered appropriate for a Jew. The non-Jew does not have a positive obligation. Therefore, the non-Jew does not have the overwhelming requirement in such a situation concerning the desecration of God's name, and therefore would not have that overwhelming situation that would allow him to commit suicide in order not to be put in that situation. It can be said that the opinions above, citing Prohibition Rabbah, we're only giving one example of a situation where there is permission for a person to take his own life, when the person would be tortured to death. But there are also other specific cases in which anyone, including a Gentile, is permitted to do so, as discussed in this chapter. So the Prohibition Rabbah is referring to the sanctification of God's name. And the argument is that here is specifically referring to a person being tortured to death, and in the process would be not sanctifying God's name, would be desecrating God's name, and therefore would be permitted to commit suicide for that, in that very specific case. But there's other, as we go through this chapter, there'll be other discussions of this question. This can be seen from the fact that there was a verse regarding Saul's death, 1 Samuel 31:4. There is no reference in this reason for committing suicide that it was because he feared that he might desecrate God's name. Rather, it was because he was terrified that from the defeat at the battlefield, his capture would lead to his torture or to humiliation of the kingship of Israel. See Radak's commentary on 1 Samuel, that's 31:4, and Rashi on 2 Samuel 1, chapter 1, verse 9. Likewise, the Midrash Bereshit Rabbah says that the word "but" in the cited verse, that was Genesis 9:5, comes to exclude King Saul, and then it says separately, the Bereshit Rabbah says separately, that it also excludes the voluntary martyrdom of the three martyrs in the book of Daniel. This implies that King Saul was permitted to commit suicide for reasons that did not apply to the three martyrs in the book of Daniel, who attempted to be killed in sanctification of God's name. That's in the book of Daniel, chapter 3, 16 and 21 through 21. In compliance with God's command that a Jew must not bow down to an idol in the presence of 10 other Jewish men, even if he is faced with death. So in the book of Daniel, the three martyrs were not allowed to bow down in front of an idol, in front of 10 Jews, even when faced with death. And therefore they went through it for that reason. King Saul would have been a different reason, and that's understood through the wording "but" within the Genesis verse in Genesis. The verse in Genesis that we learn from that verse in Genesis, that suicide is not permitted. Further proof can be brought from Tor and Shulchan Aruch Yeridea 347 and Rambam in the Laws of Mourning 111, that one should not eulogize or mourn for one who commits suicide. Nevertheless, one who committed suicide under duress similar to King Saul may be mourned, as it is written in 1 Samuel chapter 1 that King David mourned for King Saul. However, this last proof is debated by later rabbinical authorities. Some argue that it is possible that King Saul was not permitted to commit suicide, but since it was done out of fear and duress, he did not receive any punishment from God. And this is why King David was allowed to mourn for him. So if a person commits suicide, normally it's argued the person was under some kind of duress. You know, they had emotional problems, mental health issues, something was going on, and it's argued that at the moment of the person committing suicide, they regretted their action at a point that it was too late to do anything. You know, the person is dangling with a rope or is slipping away after taking drugs. At the moment that he's slipping away, he regrets what he's doing. We make that assumption, so it's possible to eulogize the person, to mourn for the person. Therefore, even in cases of suicide, any effort is made to make it permitted to mourn for the person. So obviously in King Saul's situation, it can be argued that he regretted the action. He was under such duress that he was not clearly thinking. That can be argued. And therefore it would be permitted to mourn for King Saul. It doesn't mean that it was permitted for King Saul to do what he did. Now, it could be argued also that he was a king, and therefore it would be a great dishonor to the kingship for him to be captured and tortured. Therefore, for the sake of the honor of the kingship, he committed suicide. It could be argued that was permitted for him to do. But it's questionable if that implies that it would be permitted for other people in a similar situation to do this. See Tractate of Vodazara 18a regarding the martyrdom of Rabbi Kahina ben Tridion, who was burned alive by the Romans. His disciples asked him to open his mouth so that the fire would enter and into suffering sooner. So by keeping his mouth closed, it was slowing down his death. And his students were arguing that he should open his mouth and then the death would come a little bit faster. But he would not agree to do so. However, he did allow the Roman executioner, who was a Gentile, Marshal, on that, to stoke the flames and remove the wet wool from upon his heart, in order to hasten his death. Igrit Moshe, Koshen Mishpat, Volume 2, 73:3, asks how this sage was permitted to allow a Gentile to hasten his death. It appears that he did not want to open his mouth out of his own righteousness. But since he was permitted by Torah law to do so, he allowed the Gentile executioner to hasten his death. So he was being extra pious. The Torah law would allow him, the argument goes that the Torah law would allow him to open his mouth to die more quickly. But being pious, being extra religious, beyond the measure of Torah, going beyond that, he would not open up his mouth. However, he did not do anything to hasten his death. However, it was permitted by Torah law, and therefore he was able to allow the person that was executing him to do things to hasten his death, because it would have been permitted by Torah. Otherwise, he would not. If it was not permitted by Torah law, he would not be allowed to ask anybody to do it for him. Even though a Gentile would be liable if this was committed as an act of malicious murder, when the executioner did this and then committed suicide by jumping into the flames with Rabbi Kahina, apparently as an act of sanctifying God's name, his soul was granted a divine reward. So there's two parts to this. He, in the situation, he did something that hastened Rabbi Akiva's death, which normally, like if it's in a hospital, you don't do anything to hasten a person's death. That's considered murder. In an execution, this is specifically in this kind of a situation, in this type of situation, it was permitted for him to do this, for the Gentile, the guard to do this. And apparently it was also permitted for him to jump into the flames himself, because the Gentile is said, the Gentile guard who jumped into the flames received a heavenly reward, which would indicate that it was okay for him to do that. in these circumstances. This permission is only if the one who wishes to commit suicide is being physically tortured by other people and his death is unavoidable at their hands. But if he is suffering is resulted in other situations of divine providence, and at this point we would say anything is divine providence, including times of war. But this is so it'd be resulting from other situations, which would include anything. The car swerves off the road and the person's heading into a lake would also be divine providence. The person in that case would not be permitted to commit suicide. It's only in the case of torture. The person's being put to death by torture. In that specific case is where it's being permitted. For example, illness, accidental injury, or emotional duress. So these are examples where it would not be permitted, but it'd be just anything is not permitted. Just imagine wherever a person wants to commit suicide, it's not considered permitted except in cases where we're told it is permitted. Such as the current example being given is in the case of being tortured to death. One may not commit suicide to end his suffering sooner, or may another person assist him in this to do so, or to do it for him, even at the request of the suffering person. Rationale for this distinction may be brought from the law of a rodif, the Hebrew term for one who pursues with the intent to kill. Even though murder is permitted, anyone may kill a rodif, that's the pursuer, if that is the only way to stop him from murdering. In a situation where the victim cannot save himself, if by overpowering the rodif, just as he would be permitted to kill the rodif in self-defense, he is likewise permitted to commit suicide. So we're seeing another situation where the person is being put to death by human intervention. So apparently it's a person that's in a situation where it's considered inevitable. Now I'm not really sure where we put the threshold of what is inevitable. If we're going to exclude the possibility of a last-minute reprieve or last-second reprieve, but apparently there is a threshold that would need the further definition where it's guaranteed the person's going to die, and therefore he's going to die from an attack by another person, whether a government or by warfare or just some crazy attacker is coming after the person. He is allowed to commit suicide if that threshold of certainty of death is reached, and that threshold would require further explanation. Thank you.